Professor Cho, Mr. Chan, it's a great pleasure to welcome you today on Xerfi Canal. You're in Paris for a conference about the future of Hong Kong. Professor Cho, you are a philosopher.
Yes.
You're a teacher at the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Yes.
And Mr. Chan, you are a writer of novels.
Yes.
And you have a new book just published in French, Vivre pleinement la contradiction de notre temps. So we can now discover your work in France. But the question is about the future of Hong Kong. Maybe you could describe, there is a big social movement in Hong Kong. What have produced this social movement since Hong Kong was reunited with China in one country, two systems in 1997? What was the problem? Because maybe we can feel in France that there is a deterioration of trust between the two parties.
I may have to go back a bit. Hong Kong's population ballooned in year 1949 after the communist conquest of the mainland China. There were many refugees coming over to Hong Kong. And their children, the boomer generation, grew up in Hong Kong, the first generation that really grew up in Hong Kong. And they come of age in the 70s and the 80s. So there was a kind of a Hong Kong identity after that, because at that time, China was undergoing this cultural revolution, sort of shut off from the Hong Kong people. And while Hong Kong's looking toward the West for their entertainment and education. So you see that the Hong Kong people sort of a little bit different from the mainlanders. Mm-hmm. They have their own values. So, and when Hong Kong decided to go back to China in 1997, the British government and the Chinese government decided there should be a one country, two systems. Mm-hmm. That means Hong Kong will have a systems of high autonomy ruled by Hong Kong people themselves, because they have to understand the local people have a different identity. Mm-hmm. So that was the beginning of everything. And I think it could have worked if Hong Kong people are left alone to do their own business and while under China's sovereignty. But it didn't happen all that well. As a matter of fact, at one time, Hong Kong people are very willing to be part of China. In year 2008, the year of the Beijing Olympics, Hong Kong people's identity with China was very high. Many people call themselves Chinese instead of Hong Kongers. There are more Hong Kongers calling themselves Chinese than Hong Kongers. The reverse has been the case now. So what happened? I would think since the system's almost right, that one country, two system with high autonomy for Hong Kong, ruled by Hong Kong people. But I suspect Beijing was not that comfortable having a people with higher identity under its sovereignty and not being assimilated very well into the mainland culture. So there are policies, and every time there were policies, there were strong pushback from the Hong Kong people. 2003 was the first massive demonstration against a national security law that the Hong Kong government want to pass. And then after the Olympics, the peak identification time with China, it all went down. And one of the events was China wanted to introduce national education in Hong Kong, meaning patriotic and nationalistic education in Hong Kong. That, again, aroused a big pushback from the people of Hong Kong, even among the students themselves.
Mm-hmm. That can explain now what we see now, this evolution, and you feel it very well because you have been living in Taiwan, in Hong Kong. You live now in Beijing, so you know all of these aspects of identity. And how would you define yourself?
Yes, I've been living in Beijing for 21 years, though I was grown up in Hong Kong. But since 1992, I was not working in Hong Kong anymore. I live in Beijing, I live in Taipei. I sort of understand that the people of the three places do not really understand each other. They have misjudgments all the time, though they were essentially from the same ethnic group.
Mm-hmm. So this misjudgment we see now what it can.
Yes, but the major misjudgment was China promised Hong Kong a popular election, and it was delayed, and by year 2014, China has had a proposal for Hong Kong people to accept a kind of rigged direct election. It was turned down. That was the mischance for both Hong Kong and Beijing. Otherwise, Beijing could have a showcase for the world how one country, two system worked. But since that failure, it led directly to a major protest movement known as the Umbrella Movement. That was 5 years ago, and that was the precursor of the present protest.
It was a non-violent protest, and it could have prevented this one, which is a very massive one.
Right. It was a non-violent one, but it was the first time that Hong Kong people decided to use civil disobedience. That means they could break the law just to make a point, like occupying some streets, and people pay a price for that. They willingly got arrested because of these violations. So that was the beginning of unlawful but peaceful civil disobedience.
So it was a turning point, and now we are at a new point where there are massive protests. And do you analyze that these protests are a true revolution, or is it still a social movement?
Yeah, I think the whole world is now looking at Hong Kong, and actually Hong Kong is now really facing a very serious political crisis, and some people even call it a humanitarian crisis, because this movement starting from June, and it now has already been 5 months, and over 3,000 protesters have been arrested, and then so you can see that this has never happened before in Hong Kong history. I would even believe that this is the serious movement after 1989 in China. So yes, many people call this movement as a revolution. For example, the Chinese government call it a color revolution, and then some foreign journalists call this water revolution. But if revolution means that using the military or violent means to overthrow the existing government and the existing institutions, I think that's not the case. I think most Hong Kong people now, even now, still believe that they want to have a true one country, two system. And then as Mr. Chen said that actually we want to have democracy and want to preserve our freedom and our ways of life. And then we want rule of law. So that's what Hong Kong people fight for. And so in this movement, the protests have what they call 5 demands. And 5 demands actually is, for example, including withdrawal of the extradition bill, and then establish an independent committee to investigate the whole event, whole issue. And then the last demand is about the universal suffrage. And then we hope that the Chinese government can keep their promise and give us true democracy and universal suffrage as soon as possible. So you can see that what Hong Kong people demands is basically still in the framework of the basic law. And that's what I call, this is still a social movement. Although sometimes at some points, the protesters use some quite radical or even violent means to protest on the street. But as Mr. Chen said, that actually this is a background. Over the past 2 decades, I mean after 1997, Hong Kong people has utilized every peaceful means to fight for their aims. That is, as I said, the democracy and then freedom, and protecting defending the basic rights, which we believe that which is the Chinese government promised to us in the basic law. So that's what I said. I still prefer calling this movement as a social movement rather than a radical revolution.
And is there always a possibility that this social movement wins and obtains the promise of one country, two systems to be realized as was planned in the agreements of 1997?
Yes. So what Hong Kong people prefer or what they want is not independence. Okay, as I understand, I think the majority of Hong Kong people still hope that we don't challenge your sovereignty. We don't challenge the one country, two system, but you have to keep your promise and then give us a high degree of autonomy. And high degree of autonomy means that Hong Kong people can rule themselves. Okay, not just appoint some political elite without our consent. So Hong Kong people now has a very strong sense that this is our place, our city. We want to determine our future by us. So that's what Hong Kong people understand what the high degree of autonomy means. But I think the Chinese government has different understanding. So that's the conflict between I think the Hong Kong people and the Chinese government. We have different understanding of what does it mean, the true meaning of one country, two system. We have very different understanding. And then the conflict actually arises and become more and more serious.
We see this very serious conflict. We see also from Paris that China wants to have a world power, to be one of the biggest power, maybe the biggest power in front of the US in the world, to have more soft power also.
Yeah.
If that leads also to Silk Roads and to international influence, you need to gain respect in the world, in the way you act.
Yes.
Do you think it can also be influential on the way Beijing will deal with the question of Hong Kong?
Perhaps Mr. Chen can answer this question.
I think China's rise is unstoppable, and China would always want to be respected by the international community. But there are certain ways of doing it that may contradict the accepted values of the West and many other parts of the world. So this is one of the cases, because China considers certain core interests not violatable or not compromisable. And they have to realize probably there are smarter ways to deal with the issues of these core interest areas. For instance, Hong Kong. They could have just stick to the one country, two system. Actually, as Professor Zhao said, that's what Hong Kong people want. Self-rule, democracy under China's sovereignty, and culturally being Chinese too. So I think if they know if they move back to this original position, probably everything's fine and they'll gain the respect of the world too.
Because at the beginning it was an agreement between Great Britain and China, so it's not only an internal question, this question of the future of Hong Kong.
They try to deny that it's still an international issue. That's another probably overdoing it.
Because the world is watching Hong Kong.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think also from this movement we can observe that many other countries actually are very concerned with what's happening in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is not just a city of China; it is an international and global city.
Yes.
And so it also is important that to notice that Hong Kong now is really in the front line of defending freedom and democracy in a sense. And so as China become more and more powerful, and then they want to use their own ideology and using their what we call the Chinese model to influence other countries. So we must be very aware that what China becomes will have an important impact on the whole world. So what Hong Kong people now are fighting for is not just about Hong Kong. It's also about the world politics. It also influences the relationship between, for example, the East Asia countries, also influenced Taiwan. So also influence the relation between China and US. Yeah.
And China and neighbors, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor Chow. Thank you very much, Mr. Chan, for joining us today on Xerfi Canal. And so if you want to know more, you can read this book. You can also read a lot of things you have written. You were there because there was a big conference with Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris about the future of Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.